One quiet evening at Clint Eastwood's café, he came across a young waitress facing humiliation. He intervened to help the girl when no one else did, a quiet act of courage that turned an entire room silent. The sun was setting over Santa Monica's shoreline, casting streaks of gold and orange across the calm waves as they lapped gently against the beach. The Seaside Grill, a charming cafe perched just steps from the sand, was alive with the soft murmur of conversation, clinking glasses, and the distant sound of an acoustic guitar from a street performer nearby. Through wide-glass windows, diners could watch the sun dip lower, the sky bleeding into rich purples and dusky blues. Inside, the cafe's warm lights created a cozy glow, reflecting off polished wood tables and seafoam-colored walls adorned with local art. The scent of grilled seafood, lemon, and freshly baked bread drifted through the air, mingling with the faint saltiness of the ocean breeze that slipped in through the open patio doors. It was the kind of place that felt like home to its regulars, a little haven from the busyness of life, where strangers quickly became familiar faces. Clint Eastwood stepped inside quietly, without ceremony or fanfare, the door's soft chime announcing his entrance to no one in particular. Dressed simply, in a weathered leather jacket and dark jeans, he moved with the calm ease of a man who had seen enough of life not to be easily impressed. Tonight, he wasn't here to be noticed, just to check in, to watch and listen. The cafe buzzed with energy, but beneath its warm hum, Clint's sharp eyes scanned the room. Always aware, always observing. Clint Eastwood had always been a man who valued quiet observation over loud declarations, and tonight was no different. Though his name was etched on the ownership papers of the Seaside Grill, he never used it as a reason to draw attention to himself. At 94, he still carried the kind of presence that could shift a room without saying a word. A quiet authority earned over decades, not demanded. Owning this cafe had been one of those decisions he made later in life, a way to stay close to the community he loved while giving people a place to gather, relax, and feel at home. But Clint never ran things from behind a desk. He believed in showing up, in seeing the real workings of a place when no one expected him. No scheduled visit, no announcement. Just a quiet drop-in to see if people were treated right, if the food was good, and if his staff was doing okay. Tonight had been one of those nights, an old habit hard to break. As he found an empty spot near the back, he let himself settle in, his sharp gaze casually sweeping over the room. He wasn't here to make speeches or shake hands, just to be present, to make sure the Seaside Grill still lived up to the place he had imagined when he opened it. But as his eyes traced the room, he could already sense that something was slightly off, though he couldn't yet put a finger on it. As Clint sat quietly taking in the ebb and flow of the evening crowd, a sound broke through the soft symphony of clinking glasses and low conversation. A muffled, broken sob. It was faint, almost swallowed by the noise of the busy cafe, but sharp enough to catch Clint's attention instantly. He turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source. It wasn't the kind of sound anyone expected to hear in a place like the Seaside Grill, where people came to unwind, not to cry. Rising slowly from his seat, Clint moved with careful ease, blending into the background as he followed the sound toward the back of the cafe, near the service station tucked just out of sight. There, half hidden behind a partition near the kitchen door, stood Emma, a young waitress he recognized but didn't know well, probably one of the newer hires. She had her back to the room, shoulders hunched and shaking as she gripped the counter for support. Her breaths came in quick, uneven gasps as she fought to pull herself together, wiping her eyes furiously with the back of her hand, as though she could erase whatever had just happened. Clint paused, watching quietly, a flicker of concern deepening in his eyes. She wasn't making a scene. If anything, she was trying not to be noticed, but Clint had seen enough in his life to recognize real distress when he saw it. Something had happened, and by the way her fingers trembled and her jaw tightened, it wasn't something small. For a long moment, Clint stood still, weighing whether to approach. But instead, he simply observed, knowing the truth would reveal itself soon enough. As Clint lingered near the partition, keeping an eye on Emma as she struggled to compose herself, a hushed conversation drifted toward him from the other side of the bar. Two employees, Lily, another waitress, and Jason, a young busboy, stood close together, their voices low but tense, glancing nervously toward the kitchen where Emma was hiding. Clint didn't have to strain to hear. The kind of sharp ear that had served him well for decades picked up every word. "He's been on her case all night," Jason muttered, shaking his head. "She just started a few weeks ago, and he's already tearing her apart." Lily let out a frustrated sigh. "It's disgusting," she whispered, "but no one's saying anything because it's him. You know how he is. Always flashing money like that makes him untouchable." Jason nodded grimly. "Emma doesn't deserve that. She's been trying so hard." Clint's jaw tightened as he listened, his hands slipping into the pockets of his jacket, anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior. It didn't take much to piece together the story. Mr. Hawkins, a wealthy regular, had been relentlessly belittling Emma, and the staff felt powerless to stop it. Clint had seen this kind of thing before, the kind of man who thought a tip gave him permission to treat people like dirt. A line had been crossed, and as Clint watched Emma take a shaky breath and prepare to step back onto the floor, he knew he wouldn't let it stand much longer. Clint moved back to his table, though his attention never left Emma as she wiped her face one last time, straightened her apron, and stepped back onto the dining floor with forced composure. His eyes shifted toward a corner booth, where Mr. Hawkins, a man in his late 50s with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist, lounged with an air of casual entitlement. Hawkins sat like he owned the place, one arm draped over the back of the booth, a half-empty glass of bourbon in front of him, laughing too loudly at his own joke. Around him, two men and a woman, his dinner companions, offered tight smiles, clearly unsure whether to laugh along or shrink into their seats. Emma approached their table, and Clint caught the way her posture stiffened, the way her fingers gripped the tray just a bit too tightly, like she was bracing for another round. Hawkins barely glanced at her as she reached the table, but when he did, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. A smirk Clint recognized all too well, the kind men wore. As Clint watched from his quiet corner, the tension at Hawkins' table thickened. Emma stood silently, waiting for Hawkins to finish his taunting, but he wasn't done. Picking up his steak knife, he poked at his plate dramatically, clicking his tongue in disapproval. "You know," he said, loud enough for neighboring tables to hear, "I specifically asked for this medium rare. This," he jabbed the steak again, "is medium. Do you even listen, or do you just smile and nod like a good little waitress?" His words dripped with condescension, and Clint could see how Emma's hands tightened around her tray, her knuckles white from holding back a reaction. She swallowed hard and replied quietly, "Sorry, sir, I can have the kitchen fix it if you'd like." Hawkins gave a fake laugh, shaking his head as if she were hopeless. "Oh great, so I wait another 30 minutes because you can't do your job? Maybe if you weren't so busy screwing up everyone else's orders, you'd get mine right." His friends shifted awkwardly, glancing around the café as if hoping no one was listening, though everyone was. Then, with a smirk, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "Or maybe this job's just a bit too much for someone like you, huh?" That was it. The final straw. Clint could see the way Emma flinched, the way her eyes shimmered as she blinked quickly, fighting back tears. She gave a stiff nod, murmured, "Excuse me," and turned toward the kitchen, retreating fast. Clint watched her go, feeling the weight of what he had just witnessed. And, as Hawkins laughed behind her, Clint's decision was made. This would not continue. Clint watched as Emma disappeared through the kitchen doors, her shoulders rigid, her head slightly bowed. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, conversations thinning to whispers as people exchanged uneasy glances. But at Hawkins' table, there was no pause, only the sound of his self-satisfied chuckle as he took a leisurely sip from his glass. That was when Clint stood up, slow and deliberate, rising to his full height with the quiet kind of authority that turned heads without trying. He adjusted his jacket, hands slipping casually into his pockets, and began walking toward Hawkins' booth. The distance between them felt electric, as if the whole cafe was waiting to see what would happen. Without raising his voice, Clint stopped a few feet from the table and said, "That's enough." His words, calm and low, cut through the room sharper than a shout. Hawkins, caught mid-sip, turned his head with a bemused smirk. "Excuse me? You talking to me, old man?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Clint didn't blink, didn't move. "Yeah," he said simply, his voice like gravel but steady as stone. "I've been watching you, and that's enough." Hawkins chuckled, glancing at his friends for support, but they remained awkwardly silent. "What, you got yourself a little hero complex?" Hawkins sneered. Clint's gaze stayed locked on him, unflinching. "No," he replied smoothly, "just a man who doesn't like bullies." Hawkins' smirk faltered for a split second before snapping back. "She messed up my order, that's all," he said defensively. Clint took a slow step forward, his eyes sharp as steel. "You think I don't know the difference between a mistake and a man trying to tear someone down?" he said. "You've been running your mouth all night, making sure everyone sees how small you can make her feel." Hawkins shifted in his seat, adjusting his blazer, but Clint wasn't done. "That's over now." The room had gone dead silent, every eye on them. Hawkins opened his mouth to speak, but Clint's stare held him in place, unshakable. The weight of Clint's unflinching stare seemed to pin Hawkins to his seat, rooting him in place as if the air itself had grown heavy. The arrogant smirk that had sat so easily on Hawkins' face now flickered with uncertainty, his bravado cracking under the quiet pressure of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. What had once been a cafe filled with soft conversations, clinking glasses, and the casual hum of laughter was now completely silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation, as if the very walls were listening. Clint let that silence linger, long enough for it to settle uncomfortably on Hawkins' shoulders, holding him in place with nothing but sheer presence. Then, calm and firm, Clint broke the silence. "You're going to apologize to her." Hawkins blinked, caught off guard, as though he hadn't heard right. "What?" he scoffed, giving a weak chuckle, glancing at his friends for backup, but none came. "You heard me," Clint said again, voice even but unyielding, his eyes cold and steady. "You spent the whole night tearing her down, trying to make her feel small in front of this whole room. Now, you're going to look her in the eye and apologize." Hawkins shook his head, desperate to hold on to what little pride he had left. "Over a waitress? Come on, man. You're making this a bigger deal than it is." Clint took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze sharp and steady. "It is a big deal," he said, voice low, yet slicing like a knife. "Respect is a choice, and tonight, you chose wrong." Around Hawkins, his friends shifted uncomfortably, no longer amused, realizing Clint wasn't going to back down, and neither was the room. Hawkins' fingers drummed anxiously against the table. "Apologize," Clint said again, this time sharper. "Final." Feeling the pressure, Hawkins glanced around, realizing he was alone now, his allies silent. After a long pause, he muttered, "Fine. Sorry." But Clint didn't move. He said flatly, eyes sharp as glass. "Mean it." Cornered, Hawkins swallowed, visibly flustered. "Sorry," he said quietly. This time, real. As the tension in the room slowly began to ease, Emma finally emerged from the kitchen, her face carefully composed, though her pale cheeks betrayed the storm of emotion still churning inside her. Her eyes darted from Clint to Hawkins, then to the sea of faces now watching in stunned silence. The cafe manager, Mr. Alvarez, hurried over, wiping his hands on his apron, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Mr. Hawkins," Alvarez began nervously, "if there's a problem—" But before he could finish, Clint turned slightly, giving Emma a look that said, "It's your call now." And in that moment, something in Emma shifted. She straightened her back, set her tray down on an empty table, and finally found her voice. "No," she said firmly, surprising even herself, "he doesn't need to leave." Hawkins perked up slightly, as if thinking he had won, but Emma continued, her tone growing stronger. "I won't be serving him. Not now, not ever." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear. Alvarez blinked, then nodded slowly, understanding. "Understood," he said softly. Hawkins' smirk had vanished completely, replaced with an uneasy frown. Clint watched Emma carefully, a hint of pride in his steady gaze. She had drawn her line, not from anger but from quiet strength, and everyone in the room knew it. For the first time that night, Emma stood tall, no longer shrinking under Hawkins' shadow, but standing her ground with dignity. As the moment settled and Emma stood firmly in her choice, Clint gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and took out a crisp $100 bill, laying it gently on the counter near her tray. "For good service," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. "Not charity, but recognition of her courage." Emma's eyes softened, her lips parting slightly in surprise. But she didn't argue. Instead, she gave a small, grateful nod, her hands trembling just a little as they reached for the tray. Clint turned to go, adjusting his jacket as he headed for the door, but the weight of what had happened still lingered. As he walked past the quiet tables, a few patrons gave him respectful nods, acknowledging his stand without needing to say anything. Stepping out into the cool night air, Clint paused for a moment on the sidewalk, glancing back through the cafe's wide windows. He watched as Emma resumed her work. A little straighter now, a little stronger. That was all he needed to see. He hadn't stepped in for thanks or attention, that wasn't his way. But as he walked away into the night, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up, so others can find their voice too. And for Clint, that was worth everything. Some moments in life may seem small to those watching from the outside. Just another bad customer, just another difficult night on the job. But for the person enduring it, they can leave a lasting mark. Clint Eastwood knew that better than most, which is why he couldn't turn a blind eye when he saw someone being torn down for no reason other than someone else's ego. Respect isn't optional, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. What happened that night at the Seaside Grill was a reminder that it only takes one person to shift the room, to remind others that silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of harm. Clint didn't raise his voice or throw a punch. He simply stood firm and called out what was wrong, giving Emma the space she needed to find her strength. In a world where people often hesitate to get involved, this story stands as a quiet challenge. Be the one who speaks up. Whether it's for a stranger, a friend, or a coworker, you have the power to remind others that everyone deserves respect. So if you believe in standing up for what's right in kindness, dignity, and courage, share this story. Let it serve as a reminder that doing the right thing doesn't require fame or strength, only the will to act when it matters most. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change someone's world.